What's up, guys? Welcome to the Thought Decoders channel where we teach you logic, we teach you critical thinking skills, and we show you how to use them. Tonight, we want to continue on a study that we did previously. We're looking at the book by Alan Siegel entitled Two Powers in Heaven. This book shows some of the Trinitarian seeds, as it were. It shows some of the Trinitarian seeds that were instrumental in and the theology of the New Testament authors. Like they believed that Jesus was the Son of God. Uh, they believe that there was such a thing as the Son of God. Like we don't think about that, but Jews today think that Judaism has always taught that there was just one person who was God. That monotheism is Unitarianism, right? Unitarian monotheism, and people like the Mormons and the Muslims and the Jehovah's Witnesses, they all have this Unitarian view of God, like God is one person. But God is He's a unique being. He is the unique being. God is not like man, literally because he's tripersonal, and no man is tripersonal. But a man is personal, unipersonal. So human beings have one personality, and that we are one person. It's one person that we are, but God is three persons, right? So think about that. What makes his essence, what the godness is each person is equally God, but none of those persons are the same. The Father is not the Son is not the Spirit, and the Spirit is not the Father, and the Spirit is not the Son, and so on and so on. A unique doctrine. Does it come from Scripture? Is the question. Modern day rabbinic Jews, and we call it rabbinic Judaism because they follow the Talmud, the Tanakh, which is like the Old Testament Bible, but they also follow the Talmud, which is like a history of commentators on specifically the books of Moses, the law, and the legal system. So we're looking at this book by a Jewish person named Alan Siegel. He died. He was a professor of Jewish studies, and at some university, I can't think of it right now, but I'm pretty sure I can look that up later and get back to you next time. But he was a professor of Jewish studies. He makes some striking claims in his preface. He claims that rabbinic Judaism was formed as a result of the doctrines that were taught prior to Christianity. Prior to Christianity, a view of God as there being some other being in God that was equally had as much authority and right as God. So this is what this book is about, and it's looking at the New Testament writers as forming their understanding of Jesus on the basis of Old Testament scripture. Right? So who was Jesus? Was he a man? Was he God? Did God prophesy that his son would be, that he had a divine son? And were there verses in the Bible that showed that God's essence was tripersonal, that God was three persons, that three persons were God? Is there anything that shows that? So the book that he wrote gets into that. So we're going to take a look at where we stopped off, and we stopped off on page. Page 6, I believe. So we'll get back into that. Page 6. So what we know about the rabbinic period seems to follow this general model. The standard rabbinic modes of expulsion: HRM, NDWY. So let's go back to the abbreviations really quickly. HRM, NDWY. Here are the H's. Don't see it, don't see it, don't see it, don't see it, don't see. Don't see it. Do a control find. ND. Where is my find? WY. They find anything? Oh. NDWY. Oh, okay, it's for. Okay, contemporary research on this subject has grown more wary of reading rabbinic excommunication, NDWY, and HRM into historical descriptions before the 3rd century. Here in traditions, which must be later than the 3rd century in their present context, the rabbinic modes of excommunication are not mentioned either. Rather, the Menim, who believe in 2 powers, were said to be worthy of KRT, extirpation. Okay. Now, he said he had abbreviations in the front of the book, but I didn't see them. Okay, here we go. Is this the end of the book? Maybe that just means excommunication, benediction against the mem. Maybe it's just abbreviation for the excommunication. Also, so HRM and NDWY is an abbreviation for excommunication, so it must mean a couple of words in Hebrew. Okay, so what we know about the rabbinic period seems to follow this general model. The standard rabbinic modes of expulsion, HRM and NDWY, do not seem to have been formalized in the 1st and 2nd centuries. Okay, but that's when Jesus was living. So after, it doesn't seem that these modes of expulsion were formalized in the 1st and 2nd century. At least we do not have good evidence to suppose that their use against the Menim. Menim is a word that's found in the Talmud. It's found in one of the tractates, and they call the Menim, or the heretics, people who have different beliefs. However, the process of exclusion was certainly well underway by the time of the Mishnah's codification, 200 CE. That's after the gospel writings. That's after the New Testament. That's after Jesus' death, Jesus' crucifixion, Jesus' life. This is like 200 years after Jesus that they codified the Mishnah. For the Mishnah's prohibitions, the leader of the service from saying certain benedictions associated with the Menim. Since the instrument of expulsion is liturgical in this case, perhaps we may trace the process back to the Yavnean community, where Gamaliel ordered Samuel the Small to compose a benediction against the Menim. This would have made participation in synagogue services impossible for anyone identifying himself as a men. Though the tradition is from a later source and may have been embellished in many respects, such a development would not be unexpected in the Yavnean community. There may be something we can look up later, but I take it was a Jewish community. Gamaliel was a famous Pharisaic teacher, instructor. He's pretty famous. I believe it said that Paul was taught by Gamaliel. Okay, so I guess they're saying from 80 to 115, he ordered someone to compose a benediction. Though the tradition is from a later source and may have been embellished in many respects, such a development would not be unexpected in the Yavnean community, which had to deal with the problem of understanding what the term Jew was to mean after the temple was destroyed. Okay, so the temple was destroyed after Jesus as well. and they were trying to understand what it meant to be a Jew without a temple. Therefore, we are dealing with the definition of the limits of Judaism, which developed over the time and which may have not reached uniform practice until the very end of the century. Logically, one would think that a non Jew would qualify neither as a sectarian nor as a heretic. Unfortunately, strict logic does not apply to this situation. There is a certain amount of evidence that the rabbis occasionally use the word men loosely to describe Gentiles whose beliefs and practices resembled the Jewish heresy under consideration. Okay. Okay. So basically, his point is that non-Jews were considered to be heretics and sectarian, as if they followed the Jewish, as if they accepted the way they viewed, uh, basically their worldview. So a heretic and a sectarian person is someone who shares, has an intersection of their own worldview and belief systems that they share, right? But the heretic is someone who distorts and mutates the doctrines of a community, the shared beliefs of a community. So the word men, the menim, that's used of both Jews and non-Jews. That's what they're saying. One thing is certain, the earlier scholarly attempt to identify the menim as a single group was misled. A variety of Jewish sectarian groups failed their fair heir to the rabbinic designation men depended on the context and epoch in which the specific tradition arose. Men could refer to Samaritan, Sadducee, Gnostic, Judeo-Christian, and many others. This contributes to much of the confusion in identifying heretical groups and makes the careful determination of the place and the date of the rabbinic traditions all the more important. Furthermore, in order to identify the various sectarian groups, one must also identify the heretical doctrine espoused by those groups and find evidence that the doctrine can be clearly associated with an historical group at the time the rabbinic tradition arose. So he's saying if you want to find out who these menim are that the Talmud is like speaking against, you need to know, have some more evidence. You need to know what was their doctrine, and that that group held those two things. You need to know whoever these menim are. You need to know what they believed, what they taught, and you need to have evidence that they taught it, and the evidence that they were connected with that belief. And then you need to have evidence that they were connected at that belief at the right time when the rabbis were writing against them, right? Otherwise, you can't prove it. Those heretics who believed in two powers in heaven present a more promising target in an identification of sectarian groups than do other heresies. His use of the word heresy here shows it that he's a Jew, a rabbinic Jew specifically. Because some kind of dualistic doctrine is inherent in the rabbinic designation. So he's saying, just by calling it two powers, you have a duality there. So two persons, two powers, you have something of a duality, basically, a dualism. However, as we have seen, that definition of dualism must be broad enough to include Christianity as a referent. At its beginning, Christianity was rather more binitarian than Trinitarian, emphasizing only Christ and the Father as God. Since Christianity has been suggested as a candidate for the heresy by scholars, we must be prepared to allow that the two powers in heaven were complementary instead of opposing deities as one normally expects. So what he's saying there is that since most people think the menim were Christians, we have to be open to these two powers in heaven being complementary, because that's what Christians believe, that Jesus and God were complementary. They were not opposed. They were not enemies. Okay, so you can't associate, if you think they're Christians, you can't associate them with being opposed to opposing powers, right? Like Gnostics. So they were. You can't assume that they were right against the Gnostics. The heresy may have been binitarianism or ditheism, ditheism, like divide, you split it in two, ditheism or binitarianism, depending on the perspective of the speaker, but not necessarily opposing dualism. Thus, propounding a strict definition of the heresy before looking at the evidence would be impossible. Instead, I will continue to call the heresy two powers in heaven as the rabbis did. Of course, most rabbinic passages just use two powers and assume the reader will know what it means. Only a few passages in rabbinic literature actually elaborate on the subject of two powers in heaven, and even these few passages define it from a confusing variety of perspectives. Some of the passages treat two powers in heaven as one category of heretical doctrine. Sephra, Deuteronomo, or I don't know what DST stands for. I can't even pronounce this, to be honest with you. For instance, mentions those who believe in no power in heaven, followed by those who believe in two powers in heaven, and finally those who believe that God has neither the power to kill nor to preserve. Of course, the categories for defining the heretics lack consistency. The expected parallel, many powers in heaven, does not appear here, though it is attested elsewhere. The third group is defined in different categories than the first and second. The reason for this is that the rabbinic source is primarily concerned with the exegesis of the scripture under consideration. Deuteronomy 32:39, which turns out to be a powerful argument against heretics, or so he claims. It is only secondarily concerned with categories of doctrine. Throughout the paper, considerable attention will be devoted to the pattern of scriptural citation because the scriptural supports for heresy and orthodoxy were of primary importance to the rabbis. Okay, so the rabbis were concerned about scripture, which is great because, I mean, the emphasis today seems to be more on the rabbis than on the scripture. Their attention to scripture will guide us in reconstructing the argument between the rabbis and the heretics, at least as the rabbis saw it. After this has been done, it will be possible to assess the rabbi's perspective about the content of the heresy. By outlining the difficulties encountered merely in defining terms, I am suggesting that previous studies have artificially simplified the problem. Okay, so what did he say? He says, by outlining the difficulties encountered merely in defining terms, I'm suggesting that previous studies have artificially simplified the problem, right? Because he's saying that people who have studied this issue have grouped different distinct groups together in one, and just called them the Minim and acted like everything the rabbi said was against this group, but the word for the Minim, different people are used for the Minim. People who are sectarian, people who are heretical, people who are even non-Jew, neither sectarian or heretical. People like people who believe that there were multiple gods, right? Polytheists, and that's what he's saying. So he's saying you can't use this same term for everyone. You need to figure out who the rabbis are writing against. Previous researchers have been mature scholars educated since youth in traditional texts. Rather, the passage of time has brought new information and new methodologies to light, making it possible to refine their insights and correct their biases. To appreciate the problem of partiality, one must survey the approaches that scholarship has taken on the problem. Heinrich Graetz began the study of two-powered heretics. He was attempted to relate the reports of Gnosticism and anti-Gnostic polemic in the writings of the Church Fathers with reports of sectarianism and heresy in rabbinic texts. Graet's analysis of Gnosticism centered on the figure of Elisha ben Abuya, whom tradition had branded the arch heretic. Elisha ben Abuya was disrespectfully named Aher or other. by the rabbis as if he were too infamous to be named directly. Writes, saw Elijah be Abuya as the model of antinomian Gnostic. The relationship between Ahur's apostasy and two powers in heaven is based on a long passage in the Talmud, Babylonian Talmud, which concerns four rabbis' mystical journey. Okay, so let's just summarize here quickly. So you cannot group these manim, who the Jewish rabbis call heretics and sectarian individuals, as well as polytheists. They call them all manim. So you can't call them manim and use that term to apply consistently. You're going to have some counterexamples of people who were Jew, people who were sectarian, people who were heretical. So more work needs to be done in distinguishing who this group is. We need to find the time when they lived. We need to identify what they taught, and we need to be able to prove it that they taught it at the time that the rabbis were rebuking them or writing and arguing or expostulating against them. So I'm gonna stop here. To try to do this just a short video today, and so thanks for watching us. We're getting in to understanding the Old Testament. We're gonna get into how some Jews believe that there were multiple persons in heaven who had authority, right? And we'll look through some of the evidence presented in this book. Until then, thanks for joining the Thought Decoder. Remember to